He mocked models, drank at work, disrespected designers. He was feared more than Hitler in Vogue. Who is he? Karl Lagerfeld could have said that, and you'd believe it. But the truth is, Karl spent his whole life inventing himself. He was born in Hamburg in 1933, but always claimed he was born in 1938. Why? Some say it was a phobia of aging, others a desire to remain eternally modern. But the most fascinating part? Even in official biographies, his birth date varies. I don't like reality. It's too vulgar. Young Karl lived in a wealthy but emotionally cold family. His father imported condensed milk. His mother was emotionally distant and constantly critical. She reportedly forbade him from wearing glasses because they make you look even more pathetic. It's said Karl drew his first dress at the age of 6, using blood from a cut finger. It was his sacred act, designed through pain. Horribly romantic, isn't it? As a teenager, Karl already dressed like a grown man. He couldn't stand his peers. They seemed primitive, incapable of aesthetic dialogue. Instead, he sat in the attic reading Proust, listening to Wagner, and dreaming of Paris. "I didn't want friends. I wanted culture," he once said. And he conquered Paris. In 1954, young and inexperienced, Karl won the International Wool Secretariat's design competition, along with Yves Saint Laurent. It wasn't just a victory, it was the beginning of 2 parallel myths, but more on that later. Back then, rumors circulated that Karl borrowed ideas from his rivals. One participant claimed Lagerfeld saw his sketch the day before the submission and then presented a similar one. Nothing was proven, but the reputation of an aesthetic thief stuck with him ever since. Karl built himself like an architect builds a temple, layer by layer, mask by mask. Every gesture, every word, a meticulously crafted role. The white hair, gloves, dark sunglasses, not a style, but armor, and at the same time, theater. He lied about his age, his origins, his past. But the real truth was, he created himself from nothing. In the 1950s, Paris was like a marble pedestal, cold, beautiful, and cruel. Karl Lagerfeld and Yves Saint Laurent, 2 geniuses, 2 ambitious boys, 2 future fashion titans, stood side by side at the starting line. But they were never running together. From the beginning, they were running against each other. Karl always emphasized that he was not like Yves. The latter was fragile, emotional, obsessed with the aesthetics of feminine vulnerability. Karl, a cynic, a recluse, a cold mechanism who assembled fashion like a watchmaker, without pity, but with precision. And yet, there was a connection between them. It's said that in the 1960s, Karl and Yves were entangled in an unofficial love triangle with a mysterious man named Jacques de Bachet, a bohemian prince from high society. One loved, the other possessed, the third manipulated. "We weren't friends. We were a disaster for each other," Karl once said. Their rivalry grew more toxic. When Yves became head designer at Dior at 21, Karl bit his fingers. He wasn't chosen. When Yves started gaining cult status, Karl was preparing for war. And when Yves in the 1970s began to sink into drugs and psychosis, Karl coolly noted, "Everyone has their issues. I, for instance, don't consume drama on an empty stomach." Rumor has it that during one Dior soiree, Karl and Yves had a public scene. Lagerfeld allegedly threw a glass of champagne at Saint Laurent after saying, "You're not an artist, you're a mannequin." It sounds like a myth, but in the fashion world, it's repeated like gospel. And while Yves Saint Laurent burned out, Karl was preparing the boldest step of his career. In 1983, he accepted what seemed an impossible challenge: to resurrect Chanel, a dead brand thought to be buried with Coco herself. "I'm not restoring Chanel. I'll use her skeleton as a hanger for my own ideas." And he did just that. But it's important to understand part of that energy, that madness, that aesthetic aggression was revenge. Revenge for Yves, for the past, for the youth that Lagerfeld had turned into armor. At Chanel, Karl built his empire, but he also destroyed whatever remained human within himself. When Karl arrived at Chanel in 1983, the brand was dead. Only aristocratic widows wore it, and the fashion youth considered it mothballs in a Chanel No. 5 bottle. But Lagerfeld looked at that dead brand and decided to make it a zombie, beautiful, sparkling, feathered, and chained. I won't recreate Chanel, I will mock her, but with love. The first thing he did, he took Coco's classic elements and reimagined them. Camellias? Now gigantic, like hallucinations. Tweed? In the form of mini dresses better suited to a London stripper than a duchess. It was blasphemy. And it worked. Allegedly, Karl kept a full-sized mannequin in vintage Coco tweed in his Chanel office. From time to time, he would scold it. See? That's how it should have been done. His approach was ruthless. In Chanel's studios, in the 90s, he was nicknamed the Fashion Führer. They say he once fired 12 people in a single week. The reason? Not enough black energy. One of the fired employees later confessed, "I just brought Karl coffee with milk." He looked at me like I was death. But his madness generated millions. Chanel became #1. Won again. Runways turned into spectacles. Castles, markets, airports, supermarkets, the Eiffel Tower, all became part of his collections. This wasn't fashion. It was Hollywood under the label of haute couture, and Karl himself became an icon. He was no longer a person. He was a stylized character. The white wig, black sunglasses, fingerless gloves, high collar, sarcasm instead of emotions. They say his sunglasses weren't just a style element, but a custom-made filter that rendered the world in grayscale, so he wouldn't be distracted by unaesthetic people. And yes, beneath the glamour and irony, Karl created, but he also burned himself out from within. The next chapter was a shadow he created himself, a toxic genius, a cynic, a despot feared more than adored. Karl Lagerfeld wasn't just a despotic perfectionist. He was someone who was feared, idolized, and at times deeply disliked. Behind the glamour and ambition hid a machine without empathy, unfamiliar with pity, political correctness, or limits. I'm not a Democrat, I'm an aesthete. And aesthetics, that's a dictatorship of taste. Karl, 2002. And dictate he did, but his taste often veered into blatant toxicity. Lagerfeld could publicly humiliate anyone, a model, a journalist, a celebrity. His words, sharp and merciless as blades. On singer Adele, "She's a bit too fat, but she has a beautiful face." On Pippa Middleton, "She shouldn't show her face, the back is okay." On Michelle Obama, "Her eyebrows are too big, she looks aggressive." These statements triggered waves of criticism, but Karl never apologized. Not once. He saw it as fashionable honesty. And for that, he was both worshipped and despised. In 2018, after the rise of the #MeToo, Karl publicly said, "I'm sickened by these women. If you don't want to be touched, don't be a model. Go join a convent." It caused an uproar, but Chanel remained silent. Because Karl was business, a machine that generated billions. He was allowed anything. Backstage, models called him the god with phobias. He never touched people, he only tolerated cats. Ate exclusively at home. Never allowed photos from the side. His life was cordoned off, like a museum exhibit. They say Lagerfeld had a private room in Chanel's office where no one was allowed to enter. There stood mannequins dressed in old ideals. And when Karl was enraged, he would enter and scream at them. It was his way of not snapping at the living. And then, the archives that disappear. There are legends that some of his sketches were never published because they were too dark. One of them allegedly featured a collection inspired by Aryan aesthetics. Chanel, it said, destroyed it before it could ever leak. "I don't believe in morality. It changes every season." Another phrase Karl considered his mantra. But fashion changes faster than even he thought. And when the world became kinder, more open, gentler, Karl remained in armor, and the world began to reject him. Still, death changed everything. February 19th, 2019. the fashion world came to a halt. Paris received the official announcement: Karl Lagerfeld had died. No grand farewell, no dramatic show, not even clear details on where or how. He was simply gone. And just as he lived, in complete control of his image, so he left, silently, leaving more questions than answers. I don't want a funeral. Better to disappear than be surrounded by people who just want a photo with the coffin. Karl, 2015, and he vanished, literally. Rumors have it that Karl's death was staged. They say he secretly moved to a monastery in southern Italy, where there's no Wi-Fi, only mirrors and cats. No official photos from the funeral were ever released. The ceremony was private, the details non-existent. And that birthed a legend. Did Karl really die? His beloved cat, Choupette, a white Burman beauty with millions of Instagram followers, suddenly became the symbol of an entire era. If anyone deserves my millions, it's her, Karl once said. Indeed, Lagerfeld's will reportedly included a $200 million inheritance for Choupette, but the document disappeared immediately after his death. The lawyers went silent, and part of the fashion crowd believes Choupette is the only being who truly knows what happened to her master. And then, the missing archives. Within 24 hours of his death, over 20 boxes of Karl's personal sketches, notes, and mood boards were secretly removed from Chanel's headquarters. Some were labeled too private, but soon rumors spread that among them was a script for a documentary written by Karl himself. I am my own biographer, and I haven't said my law,